Welcome to the second episode of Breaking the Stigma, an eating disorder recovery podcast. I'm here today with Scarlett O'Connor, an eating disorders intervention coach. Hi, Scarlett, how are you?
Hi, Chloe. I'm good, thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me on.
No, thank you for coming on. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. It's a nice rainy Wednesday out there, but yeah, I'm feeling pretty good. I've got my bright coloured top on, so
Awesome.
I'm playing against the weather.
Awesome. So I just wanted to start today just kind of talking about your experience, because obviously you're now an intervention coach, but previously you've been through your own journey, which kind of benefits you in your work now. So I kind of want to talk briefly about your story, both with your eating disorder and your journey to recovery.
Yeah, most definitely. I had eating disorders for 25 years. Initially, it started off with I was an overweight child, and I had an undiagnosed health issue, ADHD and dyslexia. So I had a lot of stuff going on as a kid, and I think I was fed in order to keep me quiet, I think. So I learned from a very, very young age that food was this stuffing answer to dealing with pain, dealing with emotions, etc. So as I grew up, my weight increased, which I didn't really fit in. I remember, I talk about it quite a lot now, and I remember not feeling like a little girl. As much as I knew that I was a little girl, I didn't have any identity of self. I didn't fit in with. I remember, feeling so distant from girls who were pretty and girly, and I was just overweight. And so I had binge eating disorder from a young age, and I would sort of be sick naturally because I would overeat. So I just saw that as normality, which is quite sad when you think back. But the real it was always difficult, but the real hardcore eating disorder started after I went on the diet. I think I was about 18 and a half, and I lost 10 stone. My weight had literally gone up as I got older, and I lost 10 stone and developed anorexia. And that's when I started to binge and purge around that time. Yeah.
Okay, wow. So in terms of your recovery then, because it's a long journey as well, and I know we've previously briefly spoken about your journey. It was a long one, and obviously you suffered a lot of consequences because of it. Could you just talk to me briefly about that?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. When I first, as I lost the weight, you can imagine going from being an overweight child he was kind of, I didn't fit in, I was very isolated, even left school at 13 because I just couldn't find my place in the world. And the first time I made myself sick, it actually purged, was quite violent and quite unpleasant, and I would never ever glorify bulimia or anything like that. But at that time it felt to me like I'd found this magic answer. As much as it was absolutely a horrendous experience to go through, I suddenly was okay, so I can be a binge eater, and I now have this answer. And it obviously progressed from there. And at the start, I thought I had this mastery. I really was this. Obviously, I was sliding into an addiction, because eating, binging, and purging is an addiction. I think so many people just think it is. I want to be thin, so I'm going to binge and purge. But obviously, you're playing with brain chemistry. You're messing with your neurotransmitters, and that's another podcast altogether. But so at the start, I thought I found this magic answer, and as time went by, obviously I realised that it was affecting me greatly. I lost my career, I lost all my friends, I isolated myself completely, and the effects on my body were absolutely catastrophic, awful. I'm trying to sort of not go too far into it, but I mean, you within these, anybody who's got an eating disorder, as I'm sure you know, will identify that it is very easy to ignore the effects that it has on your body, because you're so stuck in the addiction and obsessed with maintaining whatever goal it is that you are trying to get from your disordered behavior. And the disorder itself is so fluid, so as time goes by, it means different things. Like at the start I wanted to be slim, but then as time went by, the amount of shame and disgust I had with myself, it became a way of self-harming, along with an addiction. I had a food addiction, not much different from drugs or any other substance. yeah, the effects were catastrophic. And when I think back, I was able to carry on binging and purging, which I always find, you know, even though it's my lived experience, but I think how did I get through that? Like the effect on my teeth. Yet I still carried through all that pain, etc. So yeah, it did have a massive effect on me, both mentally and physically.
It's crazy, isn't it? I mean, obviously I suffered with bulimia as well. It was quite obviously a lot less time than you, but it is an addiction, and not just in terms of the binging, but it's the actual act of afterwards of obviously then purging. It's an addiction. It gets to the point where you've done it for so long that when you don't do it, it's like, you know, I'd compare it to an alcoholic not having a drink. Like it's very similar in that aspect, and it's not something that you can easily get over. And yeah, in terms of bulimia, I think, like you said, and you made a really good comment, you feel at the time, and I'm sure anyone who is going through it or has been through it, they felt like it was a secret weapon, that at the time when they first started, it was like a magical solution to not gaining weight, but being able to eat what you want. And in reality, it's not that, and it shouldn't be glorified. Although in your mind at the time, that's how it feels. You know, the further you go into it, the effects it has on your body, you don't realize it at the time, but it can be immense. And, you know, your health can be, you know, it can be detrimental.
Yeah. It's a reset button. And again, I will never ever glorify eating disorders, and it's a horrendous and horrible thing to go for. I won't say that every time I say it, because it would be ridiculous, but it's almost like a reset button. You get to binge and then you kind of erase it. Yeah. And you get to start again. It's like this reset button thing, you know, all of a sudden the behaviors have gone and you get to start again, and that becomes part of the addiction. And it also becomes ritualistic. It did with me, and it just with a lot of my clients, it becomes obsessive almost. I mean, that you could diagnose, the diagnostic criteria for eating disorders is so very difficult to fit people, as you know, into different categories, but there is definitely a massive element of OCD within the purging side of the addiction. I mean, with me, I would have to count. So I would have to make myself sick 1,000 times, and then I would have to count to 5,000 times, you know, and if I missed a number, I would have to return back to the start. And there were so many ritualistic elements within it that had to be fulfilled, that were part of the addiction. And then I'd have to see water and then blood, and it was absolutely horrendous. And it does get bigger as time goes on, like anything. Like you likened it to other substances. It evolves and it gets bigger, and it becomes more and more consuming. It's the same as the fluidity of eating disorders. They change over time. Don't they? What you start with is not necessarily where you are 2 or 3 years into the disorder. What started off with a diet or a trauma or whatever it was for you, for me, for anyone else, as the time passes, you know, it's so fluid, really fluid. It is part of our lives, isn't it? So
and like you said, it does develop, and I don't think people realize, like, for example, I started off at first it was just things like I'd use so those diet shakes, I'd start having those to replace one meal, and then it was laxatives, and then it became the point where it was an actual disorder where I was eating and realized that, you know, I could purge, and this was, like you said, it's like a reset button. It doesn't even matter that I've just done this, and then it gets worse and worse. And similarly with your, like you said, it's like a ritual. Like for me, and I've mentioned this in the previous podcast I did with Owen, that I had a ritual that if I had to go to the toilet within 15 minutes after I'd eaten, and it was like a rule. I'd never leave it longer, because in my mind, it's like if you thought, if I leave it any longer than a certain time limit, then I'm going to struggle, you know, and I won't be able to do it. And that's not a good thing. But one thing it did help me personally when I was recovering is that time limit. I then knew when I got to half an hour, if I could get to half an hour, I could go longer in recovery. So, you know, that made it easier for me in recovery. But obviously they're really, really hard to get by, because once you're in that kind of ritual flow of things, it's hard to get out of. And, you know, it's the same, like you said, with any eating disorder, and it's different per person. But you find it's a habit, isn't it? And it's hard to break.
Most definitely. Most definitely. And to get the satisfaction that you're not gonna gain weight. And I must add, like I say, it changes and it becomes different things to different people, and I see this in a lot of my clients. You need to obtain a certain result, whereas for some people it's all about calories and not having those calories, which sounds superficial, but it really isn't. And for other people it's about achieving a certain level of self-harm whilst being able to function and carry on, and that's how it was for me, because when you're having an eating disorder, it's not as obvious, if you like, as something like alcoholism or substance use, because you can still carry on being, like I did, carrying on being mum. I mean, eventually it did affect my work, but you know, there's always something to achieve within it. Within the addiction, there's something for each person. And I think that eating disorders are particularly difficult to deal with because you can carry on in a way. I mean, I literally carried on until I was an inpatient and I was faced, it was literally life and death with me. That's what stopped me in the end. But I think you'll agree, it's kind of like you can carry on to a certain extent. You find ways around it, and you
and make
find
excuses.
Definitely, obviously the lies and the shame and stuff, but even as the addiction and the disorder gets bigger, you kind of find ways around it, don't you? Know, you sort of find ways to deal with it and to appear normal. And you know, I'm sure if we sat here and recounted the lengths that we'd gone to and the lies that we told, we could write a book with them, most definitely. The things I would tell the dentist, you know, while he was thinking to say, really? You know, and but you do, don't you? And it just, you find ways around it, most definitely.
You do, and obviously that's not a good thing, we both know that, but when you're actually in it and you're suffering at the time, mentally it's not something that you see as a problem, you see it as a solution to something you're trying to solve, whether that be a bit of exactly, whether it be self-harm or a goal like losing weight. But then once you reach that goal, I know it was for me, I reached my goal, but then I surpassed it and I kept making new goals because I was like, you know, it's hard to let go, and it is. And I think talking about, you know, letting go in terms of recovery, I mean, we've briefly spoken about this before when we've chatted, but in terms of, I know we've had very different experiences in terms of our support that we've had when we were going through it. So can you just tell me, when you were getting to the point of recovery, what support did you have in place, if any, and what helped you get out of it in the end?
Oh goodness, so we're very different ages. I mean, I'm 47 now, so we're from totally different, I want to say eras, that doesn't sound right, but generations. The things were so generations, different. We're very different back for when I was young and when it started for me. And I often wonder, how did I know what to do? Because I think nowadays there's so much out there for young people, unfortunately. You can almost get a script of how to be disordered, and I often think, how did I know? Anyway, but I went through pretty much everything that was available in the UK health system, and I was eventually admitted, you know, help wise, and none of it ever worked for me. I also tried lots and lots of alternatives. I spent thousands and thousands of pounds, and nothing ever worked for me. Apart from when I literally came to the point where it was a life and death decision, and I would have been sectioned, and I would have lost my children and my husband, and that was I'm still trying to find the word when I talk about this. I can't find the word for what it was that happened to me. It was one of those on your knees crying kind of, and the word epiphany is not correct. I don't know what it was, but
it's some sort of a turning point, isn't it? Like, and one thing I'd like to say, just as you're talking about that, so a common occurrence seems to be with anyone that I've spoken to that suffers is it's not really you caring about you in the situation as to why you decide, oh, I need to get over this. It's usually for the love of other people. So for you, your husband and your children, like for you, you know, you needed to get better for them. It wasn't really for you. Otherwise, like you said, you'd keep going. Like most of us, for me, it was my partner. I know for other people, it was other family members. And it's for other people when you realize, actually, like I'm at the point now where this could be detrimental to them, not to me anymore.
Which is the nature, like I said before, this, you know, the way with eating disorders, that as much as they are addictions and they allow you to carry out your roles and care for other people, which is why I feel like they go as far as they do, because they don't directly take you out of those places, whereas other substances and things do. But yeah, other people definitely. I mean, within my pregnancies, I, you know, and I've forgiven myself. I have no shame around my eating disorder. I talk so rawly and so honestly that some people sort of go a bit quiet. Like, but even within my pregnancies, I was a lot gentler on myself and my body, because I had another little person inside me. And it was like, I'd be lying if I said that I didn't fully stop. I did gain weight and have good weight babies, thank goodness. But you know, that in itself is enough to show. And I don't even know how I conceived. You know, it was obviously meant to be. I was so light and so tiny, but I was able in those times to be easier on myself and, you know, go a little bit. So you're right. Yeah, it normally is because of other people. But, you know, ultimately, recovery can't be sustained if it isn't done for the sufferer themselves. But I think you're right. The original triggers and cues to push people into that place are definitely from people or situations around you. But to be honest, for me, I would be lying if I turned around and said I did it for my children. I did it because I was going to die, and that is a really hard thing to admit. It's a really hard thing to admit. I couldn't stop for my children, and that's awful because they're my babies, and obviously I would give my life for them. But at that time, I couldn't. Not until it came to the actual point where it was like one more time and that's it. It's game over for you. So that's what stopped me. That's the raw reality of how bad it can get, you know.
And I think that's a key point. Like you said, it was about, did you say 25 years, wasn't it, for you with your eating disorder?
And the actual severe binging and purging, because my binging and purging was literally 6 hours I would be at it. You know, I could eat masses of food and I would be doing this. It was horrendous. And that was probably from when I was around 20. It got really bad to about 38 was when I went into recovery, when I faced that moment and I had to start looking at myself and changing.
And I think that's a key thing. So you know, the sooner intervention happens, the easier recovery is going to be. And it sounds really simple, but in essence it's not, because intervention is hard to start off with because some people don't talk about it, and you know, they can't have open conversations. It depends on their support system, if they're able to get help from places from the NHS, and you know, loads of different factors. And then, like me, for example, I'm quite lucky. I say I'm lucky, but it was only 5-6 years for me in total. And I didn't personally have the help from NHS or anything like that, because my family support system, the stigma was really high for me. You know, I was given an ultimatum when they found out about my eating disorder, and it was quite, you know, it wasn't supportive. And then at school, I didn't have that support system. Like, there wasn't really anyone there that could help me get in, you know, find a doctor to go to, or encourage me to go at least. So I, like you said, when it's you don't really feel the need to, you don't want to, because it's an addiction. So I didn't want to take myself to the doctors and try and sort it out. I probably needed someone to intervene, but I was quite lucky that, again, I don't like to use the word lucky, but in the fact that I got to a point where in myself, I wanted to be better for myself, but also, as I've mentioned on my previous podcast episode, that my partner, you know, I don't know if I want to have kids, but if I do, I don't want that taken away from him. And, you know, because I love him so much, and that was a key thing for me. And like you said, it's a form of self-harm. And I kind of got out of a very toxic situation with family and a few other things. And I think getting out of that gave me the breathing space to be able to think rationally about certain things. So I wasn't self-harm. I didn't want to self-harm. I didn't.
You had that trigger switch.
Yes.
And it doesn't always have to be, you know, like mine is sometimes I think, gosh, you know, Scarlett, that's so dramatic. But that's just how it was for me and how it got for me. But there's no difference in what you've just described. You had that trigger switch, and that trigger switch was that important to you because you love your partner, and that's your switch, right? So it's no different, you know.
Exactly. And
that's the key to the start.
And one thing I want to touch on as well, in terms of recovery, so something I've mentioned quite openly on social media is that one thing for me, and I know you've mentioned it before about getting into healthy habits in recovery. So I think that's a really important point. So even I've said very openly, once I got out of my eating disorder, I was actually skinnier in the years after, because getting into a normal routine with eating was so difficult after I beat the bulimia that I became skinnier and quickly dropped a load of weight. So I then started.
Yeah, everybody's so different in that.
It is, yeah. And, you know, it was hard because it got to the point where I was losing my hair and, you know, I started suffering with depression among many other things. And like I said, I won't go too deep into that, but I find, and I mentioned to you before, that ballet was something for me. It was a constant physical activity that I wasn't over exercising like I used to when I was younger, but it was something healthy that I could focus my mind on. And it was a healthy habit in terms of, and also eating, for example, like certain healthy habits I've adopted, and I've tried to, it's strange to say, but it's as if I've kind of swapped certain habits with other habits, but healthier ones, which have kind of helped me in terms of recovery. And I know you've briefly mentioned before that you've had the same thing where you've kind of, your recovery was helped because you adopted healthier habits. And it's easier said than done, but you know, it's doable.
I mean, I think, you know, something that you've just addressed there, in a lot of traditional recovery, even if you mentioned the word exercise, they were, I say they, me going against the system a little bit there, a little bit of a rebel, but they'd be like, no, you can't possibly exercise because that's not in line with recovery from an eating disorder. And the one thing I always say is, when you go to extremes of anything and say, no, don't do that in recovery, to me, and I find this with myself, with the clients, you are instantly talking to that eating disordered voice. And anybody who is watching this podcast will instantly understand what that eating disordered voice is. That constant mind chatter that is in your head from pretty much day one that you develop that disorder, telling you, you know, whatever negativity it is telling you around food and what's going to happen and what isn't going to happen, etc. And I think within recovery, when I and when clients are told, don't do this, don't exercise, or do eat this food and write this down and do this and do that, I think very often you can't get past that eating disorder voice. And I see this so much, and I saw it in myself, because every approach that I tried was just so very, very triggering, because they would be revisiting traumas and it was always a conversation with my eating disorder voice. They couldn't even get to me beyond that, because everything was so rigid. You know, don't exercise. I mean, I think if you'd have gone into therapy and said, I'm going to do ballet, I think the alarm bells would have been so loud everybody would have left the building at that point.
100%.
They would have literally been, are you sure ballet is not an answer to the eating disorder? Absolutely, don't do that. But there's living proof right there that, you know, using extremes in recovery within a disorder that is about extremes is not a good thing. And that's where people get a little bit cross with me, because I don't agree with that. And you're right, it is about swapping behaviors and destructuring and changing the way that we behave, rather than not allowing things. And that's kind of part of my approach, really, and part of how I manage to recover. So I think it's fabulous that, but you can see how the word ballet would be spinning heads with a lot of
definitely. I mean,
and it's worked for you, which is beautiful.
I've had conversations with people before, and when I say that ballet, honestly,
I think even I misunderstood you.
No,
as a professional and someone with lived, I got it the wrong way around straight away. I thought you were saying that ballet had caused it. So that even shows you that I'm so open-minded to different approaches to recovery. And I was like, oh, okay, so it was caused by ballet. And you were like, no. So it just shows you that, you know, it is about swapping behaviors. You're so right.
Yeah, like I've had conversations with quite a few people. And when I talk about ballet, exactly the same as your reaction when I first told you, it's kind of like, no, because it's a common thing, actually, because Yeah, in ballet, like it's kind of known that they kind of are strict on weight, and they're very, careful with what they eat. And actually, eating disorders are quite common in those industries. But like, it's not for them. And I don't do it competitively. I'm not a professional in any way. I started, in my mid-20s, but it was that replacement for me. So it was
the joy is on your face right now. Your face is literally lighting up when you're talking about it. So it's obviously done wonders for you.
I mean, it's like a release for me. It's like, it's a positive way for me to, at the end of the day, I can go and I can dance in class, or I can learn how to do certain things. And it makes me happy to do that. And, it's something that I work on and I can focus my mind on. And it's positive, it's something positive. Exactly. And I've actually gained more weight since, like a healthy amount of weight since doing ballet, because I'm also increasing my muscle as well, obviously from doing it, because it's quite a hard, not sport, but it is, but it's quite hard on your body. And it's actually, I always say it saved my life, and it has to a degree, because I think without starting something like that, I wouldn't have gained the weight that I have now. So, it's something I always really appreciate. So one thing I just want to touch on quickly then. So obviously, like you said, you're really open-minded, like we just discussed, and I think that's amazing.
That have happened to me in recovery have been quite bizarre. Recovery is so unique.
It is. It is.
Mine has been particularly fierce.
Yeah, and I think anyone I've spoken to about it, everyone's journey is very different. And anyone who's gone through the traditional NHS system, which is nothing to knock the NHS, but unfortunately it's the case, like you've said, that there's certain establishments that kind of see it as it's a one-way street, and this is the route you have to go down to get better. But that's not the case, and everyone's very different. Everyone's eating disorder is different. The way they deal with it, their triggers are all very different.
You've got to fit the criteria first for diagnosis, which absolutely boils me, because you can be overweight and anorexic, or underweight and bulimic, and etc. It's very, very difficult to access treatment now. They just keep moving the parameters and the diagnostic criteria, I feel. So it's very difficult to even access help, let alone to get it to work, because it's so individual, like you say.
Yeah, it is. So I mean, for younger, especially younger people, because realistically eating disorders tend to start at a younger age because we're more impressionable. And like you said, it's one of those things where we've spoken about this before, where I have friends that wanted to be skinnier at school, but they didn't end up with an eating disorder. And it's because you've got an underlying, issue or mental problem that causes you to go that way, where your friends don't. So
core beliefs and core understanding about yourself and your personality and your identity and your self-image that are normally formed 0 to 7, potentially older than that. But that's the difference, like they say social media causes eating disorders.
No.
You can have 5 people of the same that identify the same, of the same weight, same height, etc. They're not all going to get eating disorders, are they? It is a predisposition. I personally do not believe that there is a gene or a personality type that causes eating disorders, because my personality was massively changed by my eating disorder. The elements that I had then, the obsessive tidiness, obsession with germs, all of these kind of things were most definitely not inherent parts of me as a person. Quick look around at the mess. But you do get this, and I don't believe that we are born. I think there is certain personality types that are more likely to get eating disorders. There are elements of me that are extreme, which are fabulous. Love that. But, I don't believe that it's a genetic thing. And I don't believe that everybody is affected in the same way, like you say.
No, exactly. It's a lot to do with your traumas and like your mental predisposition to a degree, like you said, how you see yourself. And pretty much everyone who suffers with an eating disorder probably has body dysmorphic disorder. They see themselves in a different light. I mean, obviously I'm not a therapist, I'm not a licensed coach,
not always, but
it's a common thing.
There's always an underlying root cause to everybody who has disordered eating. It's no different than substances and etc. Very often it is just to do, very often it comes from the fact that you're under or overweight and you're not accepted by society. You want to change that, and then it becomes an obsession and an addiction. But I think I've said this before, eating is fluid. And eating disorders change over time, and what they originally surface as it's not going to be the same a year down the line, 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, which is why now, and the way that I recovered was not looking at the original causes of why I got my eating disorder, because I would have just gone round in circles and never ever got anywhere.
Yeah.
It's more about looking at where you are in the now. And that's how I work now. My methodology is, yes, validate, you know, what happened and why. It's very valid and very important.
Yeah.
But it's so fluid, you know, so you have to look at where you are in the now, you know, like your eating disorder, 6 years, you started in a certain place. I'm pretty sure that throughout those 6 years, it would have been so fluid that it would have changed all the time. Right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, my eating disorder started off with weight loss. It most definitely didn't, you know, 18 years down the line when I'm losing teeth and vomiting blood every day. I wasn't thinking, I just want to be thin. I was not, it's very, very fluid. And that's what recovery was about for me. And that's what I see within my clients. It's working in the now. What is it serving for you now? Where are you with it now? You know?
And I think that's such a unique methodology to have. And I think that's why, you know, I love talking to you, because I think it's so different from, you know, the standard spiel that you get, or people who are trying to recover get.
I don't have shame within we do not have to confess. I remember going into so many offices. How much do you eat? Where do you eat it? How do you binge? Where do you purge? The shame attached to that was absolutely awful for me. And I'm sure it is for other people. And men. Let's talk about men, because it's seen as a female. I know you've had a man on already, so I don't want to take away from that, but it's seen as a female disease. And imagine going and being asked those questions and having that shame attached to it, and being a man as well. You know, I've got male clients, had male clients, terrible. But so within the way that I work, we don't need to talk about, you know, we already know that we do that. Why do we need to write it down? Why do we need to have a diagnosis? Why do we need to fit into a box? Well, you're actually, no, you're not. You've got disordered eating, so let's work with it as it is. Let's not try and fit it into a box, and let's not shame ourselves, and let's not re-traumatize ourselves. You know, within some, and I'm sure I can't remember if you said you went for therapy or not, but it's kind of like people are revisiting week in, week out, and re-traumatizing and writing down what they've eaten and then re-traumatizing, which I don't see the benefit to. It doesn't work. It's not, you know, it's not the right way to get things done.
No, and I guarantee that I guarantee there are people who listen to this that have been through it, that they've experienced this and probably agree. And the problem is, like, going through that route, like you said, if anything, it can make things worse. So your methodology, I think, like I said, it's so unique, and it's so interesting talking to you, because I think your clients have, you know, an outlet and someone who's there as a support that's actually productive in a way that's specific to them. So it's
most definitely. And there's a lot of grey. I talk about grey a lot because there's a lot of black and white in eating disorders. And the way that when I first meet a client, from my lived experience, obviously I'm a qualified therapist, but from my lived experience, I think, right, I'm not even talking to you at this point. I'm talking to your eating disorder's voice. We're not having a conversation yet. So I've got to find the grey with you. I say I've got to facilitate that finding of the grey, so that we can negotiate a little bit before we even get into recovery or any kind of anything. There needs to be a negotiation with that voice. If that makes sense. Anybody listening with any would be like, oh, should I talk to it? I am. I'm going to find it and have a chat alongside, which sounds absolutely insane, but it really is the only way through, because as you know, that voice is so very present, and it's so loud. It takes over everything, doesn't it?
It is. And equally important, not just for the people who are going through it, but for people listening who are listening to this because they want to help someone else going through it, a loved one. They wouldn't have known this. You know, it's something that only someone who's going through it is aware of. So it's easier to help someone when you're aware of these things. So I think that's incredibly important.
You're not talking to that person, you're talking to that voice. And I've had to say this to so many people who, you know, how can I help?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of angry reactions to people, as you experienced,
Mm-hmm.
but also the people who want to help, and a lot of therapists and coaches. Well, I'll eat with you and we'll talk about it, etc. I think the first port of call is to realize that you're not actually communicating with that person, and the minute that you try and talk to them about their disorder, that voice is going to be like, I see you, they're coming for you. They're gonna ruin us. They're gonna make you big. They're gonna make you eat. They're gonna do this. So it's kind of like getting that understanding that either as the therapist or the person trying to help, you've initially got to bypass or find your way around the side of that voice.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's such an important point. And thank you so much for coming on. I think, like I said, I think this is really enlightening, not just for people going through it, but people who want to help other people. So thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.